Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining me for the Stanley Grey Lecture. I'm going to tell you about the grey whale cycle, a journey I undertook last autumn following the migration of grey whales from Alaska to Mexico. And this idea was supported by the IMarEST David Henderson Inspiring Journey Grant, a grant of £5,000 to support an adventurous journey with a marine theme. So I'd like to start by saying a massive thank you to the family of David Henderson and to the IMarEST for transforming my idea into a rain-soaked reality, an adventure of a lifetime. And the star of the show is, of course, the grey whale. They're baleen whales, so instead of teeth, they have baleen and filter feeders. They're the only species of whale that's predominantly a benthic feeder. In shallow seas, they suck up mouthfuls of sediment from the seafloor and then expel the sediment, leaving small invertebrates trapped by their baleen. However, they will also sieve prey from the water column and forage around kelp beds. Adult whales average about 14 metres in length and can weigh 30 to 40 tonnes, and a single calf is born after a gestation period of 12 to 13 months, weighing 5 to 900 kilograms and already measuring 4 to 5 metres in length. On average, grey whales reach sexual maturity at about 11 metres, and the females will then have a calf every 2 or more years. And this map of their distribution is from the IUCN website, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The two areas in the North Atlantic around Iceland and by the east coast of America represent the North Atlantic population, which became extinct around the start of the 18th century. So two populations remain in the North Pacific, one in the west and one in the east, both of which were hit hard by commercial whaling. In 2018, the Western Pacific population was categorised as endangered and possibly extinct by the IUCN. Even the eastern population was thought extinct at one point, with whaling having reduced the population from 24,000 to 2,000 whales. However, since then, the eastern population has recovered well, and it was removed from the US endangered species list in 1994. And then in 2016, the population was estimated to number almost 27,000 whales. In May of last year, however, NOAA Fisheries declared an unusual mortality event in the eastern Pacific after higher than usual numbers of grey whales started washing up along the west coast of the US. Another unusual mortality event occurred in 1999-2000, when over 600 whales washed ashore. There were also fewer calves born in those years, and higher than usual numbers of emaciated whales were seen. And this latest unusual mortality event, declared in May 2019, is still ongoing. So like many baleen whale species, grey whales are migratory. They feed in cold, rich waters and breed in warmer waters. And they've got the longest migration of any mammal species. The migration route of the eastern population follows the west coast of Baja, the United States, Canada, up to the Bering Sea. So in winter you'll find the whales in the warm waters of Baja, some inside the sheltered lagoons and others just in coastal waters there. The calves are born here and mating behaviours are also observed. By about March, the whales will begin travelling north again, back towards the colder feeding grounds, and the females with calves usually being the last to leave. Then most of the whales have reached their feeding grounds by late May and will stay through till about October, with the calves being weaned over the summer months. But not all of the whales will travel that far. About 1% of the population will spend the summer months feeding off the coast of Northern California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska. And this group is known as the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. Then around October, as the days shorten and temperatures drop, the whales will begin to swim south again. And this is the journey I planned to follow the southward migration of grey whales from the Bering Sea to the waters of Baja. So it was that I flew to Alaska last autumn And after reading that some of the Pacific Coast feeding group feed off the coast of Kodiak Island, I decided to start my journey there. Landing in Kodiak on the 24th of September, I reassembled my bike at the airport and set off. Seiche Bay, the bay where grey whales are regularly seen, was a hilly 40-mile cycle from Kodiak, and after a night camped near the airport, I was on my way. I'd been warned of obnoxious cattle and also a herd of buffalo, but apparently there weren't too many bears near Seiche. And I'd planned a few days to search for the whales, but I was in luck almost straight away when I went exploring and spotted the blows of whales feeding just in the next bay. This incredibly dull photo was actually a very exciting moment for me. If you really squint, there are 3 puffy little white blows of 3 grey whales beyond the fishing vessel, but at times I counted at least 6 whales just offshore, and that evening I could even see blows from my tent. The next day, in not quite such brilliant weather, I managed to see 2 grey whales from a kayak. We launched from a beach just along from the campsite, and we paddled into grey choppy seas until distant blows were suddenly not quite so distant, and we spent an amazing half an hour with the whales surfacing around us. It was the best possible start to my trip. The next day, I cycled the return journey to Kodiak, wrapping up my 5 days on the island. Before starting my trip, my main worries had been that I wouldn't see any grey whales, the weather would be horrendous, and I would be terrorised by bears. After a few days on Kodiak Island, I'd already seen grey whales, so that absolutely removed that from my list of concerns. However, bears and the weather remained on my list. On my first night of camping near the airport, I'd almost cycled into a bear as it was getting dark, and then I'd been kept awake all night by noises around my tent. This was my face at 3 a.m, with 5 hours still to go until sunrise. So it was with some relief that I boarded the Kennecott, one of the Alaska Marine Highway System's ferries. This was the last ferry of the season from Kodiak all the way to Bellingham in Washington state, a journey of 1,935 miles that would take 5 days and 6 nights. That was 5 days and 6 nights in a bear-free environment, camping on a covered deck beneath solarium lights. The wind howled, it rained, it snowed, but it was great. We cruised past mountains, glaciers, small towns, and so many trees. And then, in the more sheltered waters of the Inner Passage, I saw killer whales, Pacific white-sided dolphins, humpback whales, and yet more trees. Then, a bit earlier than I felt ready for, the ferry docked in Bellingham and I was on the road again. This was where the punches began, but luckily there were some lovely cyclists who stopped and helped me with my first puncture, otherwise I would most definitely have missed my ferry to San Juan Island. On San Juan Island, it was great to stay with Dr. Frankie Robertson, a friend and marine mammal scientist. Our shore-based whale watching didn't result in any whales. Instead, we had to make do with otters, foxes, eagles, deer, and diving ducks. From Victoria on Vancouver Island, I went on an excellent whale watching trip with Dr. Anna Hall, a captain and marine mammal expert. Again, there weren't any grey whales to be seen, but the humpback whales and killer whales were out in force. After catching my last ferry, I was back on the mainland ready to cycle out to Near Bay on the tip of the Olympic Peninsula. Near Bay is a small town on a reservation belonging to the Makah tribe, an indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest that have long lived off the land and particularly the sea. So 2,000-year-old harpoon barbs and whale bones have been uncovered from a Makah village buried and preserved by a mudslide, evidencing the tribe's long history of whaling. The tribe stopped whaling voluntarily in the 1920s when commercial whaling decimated the grey whale population, but once the eastern grey whale was removed from the endangered species list in 1994, they wished to resume subsistence and ceremonial whaling, a right that's written into their treaty agreement. This request was approved by the International Whaling Commission, And in 1999, the macaw hunted their first grey whale in over 70 years. However, in 2000, the court's 1998 decision to allow their whaling to resume was overturned, and a lengthy legal process has rumbled on since then. And during my cycle trip, there was a court hearing that took place, and as far as I know, a decision is expected soon. I'd hoped that while I was in Near Bay, I might be able to speak with a member of the macaw tribe about their struggle to resume subsistence whaling, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. There's an excellent museum there, though, at the Macaw Cultural and Research Centre that I learnt a lot from, and I was also very happy to see a grey whale from the beach beside the campsite. My next stop was La Push, the home of the Quileute tribe. Here I was able to meet with Emily Foster, a Quileute tribe member and editor of the local newsletter, and we talked about the tribe's historical whaling, the present-day fishing, and the future. Since 2007, the Quileute have had a Welcoming the Whales ceremony as the whales reach La Push during their northward migration each spring. The ceremony includes prayers, singing and dancing, and an offering of salmon paddled out to sea on a raft by students of the Quileute Tribal School. Later, Emily sent me the latest edition of her newsletter, in which she'd written an article about my trip. Far more interesting, though, was an article by Jay Powell, the author of a book called The 100 Most Important Words in Quileute. In that edition of the newsletter, he covered words associated with fishing and whaling. And I soon learnt there are Quileute words for summer whales and winter whales. Whales caught in the summer were returning north to the feeding grounds and, having not eaten for months, had less blubber. Their meat could still be eaten, but the whale wouldn't yield much oil. The whale that was really prized was the winter whale, caught between August and November. And these whales had only recently left the feeding grounds. They had thicker blubber and they yielded far more oil. The article also described how a whale would be divided between the men in the whaling canoe depending on their role in the hunt, and which bit of the whale would be used for the feast held after the whale cutting ceremony. After La Push, my route south was often inland through dense temperate rainforest. Without any chance of seeing grey whales, I'd planned long days to cycle to cover some ground. Although often cold and wet, the autumn landscapes were stunning, and I saw plenty of eagles, a variety of squirrels, and a coyote along the way. Unfortunately, I was also plagued by punches that really slowed me down, and at times the weather was epically bad. And then I crossed into Oregon, where the punches and rain continued. Living in Scotland, I thought I knew about rain, but Pacific Northwest rain was in a league of its own. It made for some really tough days and chilly nights. By the time I reached Depot Bay, I'd had 4 punches in 4 days. I'd lost quite a lot of time, and I was low on morale. Luckily, Depot Bay was about to pull out all the stops. Right on cue, in the time it took to eat second breakfast near this fountain, both a grey whale and a killer whale passed by just offshore, and I cheered up immensely. And that was just the warm-up set. Rocky Creek State Park, just south of the town, there were 3 grey whales really close to shore. They were right there. It was incredible, and the punches were temporarily forgotten. Newport, just down the coast, is home to Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute, and it's a real epicenter of marine mammal research. It also had a bike shop, and having ordered some solid tyres for my bike, I had a week to pass while I waited for them to arrive. One of the people I got to meet was Professor Bruce Mate, who had previously been director of the Marine Mammal Institute. Bruce had played a key role in the development and use of satellite-monitored radio tags to study the movement patterns of marine mammals, and I was particularly keen to ask him about his study he'd been part of, looking at the migration movements of grey whales in the Western Pacific. Remember that the Western population has not recovered from whaling and is endangered. They feed off Sakhalin Island in Russia, but their migration corridors and winter grounds are unknown, so it was hoped that this study would shed light on the threats that the whales are facing. In 2010 and 2011, satellite tags were attached to 7 grey whales that were feeding off Sakhalin Island. The tags transmitted the whales' locations multiple times per day, and that information was sent to Bruce and his team. Of the 7 tags, 3 worked long enough to document the whales moving away from Sakhalin Island, and all 3 went to the east, to Alaskan waters. 2 tags continued working long enough to show the whales had joined the migration corridor of the eastern grey whales, and 1 tag functioned long enough to reveal that the whale migrated more than 10,000 kilometres, almost to the southern tip of Baja, the longest recorded distance travelled by a mammal. And in fact, the tag continued working as the whale migrated all the way back to Sakhalin, a round trip of 22,511 kilometres over 172 days. So for starters, these remarkable results showed that grey whales are much better navigators than previously thought. Far from just following the coastline, they can and they do make long open water crossings. And also, because whales usually show strong fidelity to their mother's migration movements, this suggested the tagged whales were born in Baja. This raised serious questions about the status or even existence of the western grey whale population. It could be that the western population still exists, but is even smaller than previously thought, because some of the whales seen feeding off Sakhalin are actually eastern grey whales. Or perhaps the western population is already extinct, and all the whales seen feeding off Sakhalin and occasionally in the waters of Japan are actually just eastern grey whales with a wider range than previously thought. And there have been 2 unusual sightings in the last decade that demonstrate that grey whales can actually be extremely wide-ranging. One sighting was in the Mediterranean, first off the coast of Israel and then Spain, and another sighting 3 years later in the South Atlantic. The grey whale seen in the Mediterranean in May 2010 was thought to be a vagrant from the eastern Pacific population. This map shows the migration route of eastern Pacific grey whales from Baja to the Bering Sea in yellow. Then the routes in red show the 2 most likely routes that the whale took from there to the Mediterranean. The route along the coast of Russia and Europe was the most ice-free and was considered the most likely option. Travelling at the usual migration speed of approximately 5.3 kilometres per hour and taking a direct route across some stretches of deep water, the journey would have taken approximately 85 days. If the whale had hugged the coast a bit more, it would have taken more than 100 days. And either way, it's a remarkable journey, and one that the author suggested might be made by more grey whales as the ice cover in the Arctic decreases. And it seems they were right, as in May 2013, a grey whale was seen off the coast of Walvis Bay, Namibia. This was not the same animal that was seen in the Mediterranean. The whale remained in the area for over a month and was presumed to be feeding there. And this was the first sighting of a grey whale in the South Atlantic or anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere. Another scientist I met in Newport was Assistant Professor Lee Torres, Principal Investigator of the Geospatial Ecology of Marine Megafauna Lab at the Marine Mammal Institute. Lee leads a number of studies of the grey whales that feed off the coast of Oregon during the summer months. One study that's recently been published by Limos et al. Used drones to assess the body condition of grey whales between 2016 and 2018. The whales were photographed from above, and then the images used to calculate their body area index, a measure of body condition. And these 3 photographs of the same female through time show her body area index was lowest when she was lactating, and highest less than 4 months later when her calf had been weaned. And the study found that the body condition of grey whales had declined between 2016 and 2018. The decline was correlated with an upwelling index in previous years, with years of poor body condition following years of weak upwelling. And discussing these findings in relation to the ongoing unusual mortality event, Limos et al. Hypothesized that perhaps grey whales can withstand 1 or even 2 years of poor prey conditions, but that 3 years exceeds their resilience, resulting in higher mortality and fewer calves being born. In addition to the weak upwelling from 2016 to 2018, there were also record-breaking El Niño conditions and the occurrence of the blob, a marine heat wave that peaked in the northeast Pacific in 2014 and 2015 and saw water temperatures more than 2.5 degrees centigrade above average. The heat wave disrupted ecosystems along the west coast of America, and at the time I was in Oregon last year, another marine heat wave reaching from Alaska to California appeared to be developing. I learned more about the impact of these oceanographic changes when I reached Port Orford, home of the Port Orford Field Station, the base for an ongoing study of the foraging behaviour of grey whales. Underwater GoPro footage used to measure the availability of the grey whale's prey had also documented the recent decline in kelp forest and the dramatic increase in purple urchin numbers, a phenomenon occurring all along the coast. In 2014, concurrent with the increased water temperatures, the loss of sea stars to a wasting disease, and an explosion of purple urchin numbers, more than 90% of the bull kelp forests in Northern California were lost. The kelp losses have been greatest where a loss of biodiversity of urchin predators has reduced the resilience of the ecosystem, highlighting again the importance of maintaining diverse ecosystems. Continuing south, my days mostly involved looking out for whales as I cycled, then usually reaching a campsite with just enough daylight remaining to be able to read when a bear or cougar was last seen there. Then I would cook up some noodles before putting all my food and cooking equipment inside my bear canister so that the raccoons could keep me awake all night as they bounced and rolled it around the campsite. 6 weeks and 900 miles into my trip, I made it into California. I didn't celebrate for long, having realised by then that California is huge and I still had miles of cycling to go. But I was thankful that rain and lower temperatures had reduced the risk of the recent wildfires returning. Cycling through the redwood forests was incredible, but also incredibly nerve-wracking, as I considered them prime bear habitat. Seeing 2 more bears on my first day in Northern California had done little to calm my nerves, but I did enjoy a good motivational message along the way though. And it was in Northern California that the elk warning signs finally delivered. It also got a little spooky at times. Then a couple of days later, I had stopped for lunch when I overheard someone mention a whale stranding. A grey whale had recently stranded on a beach that I had just cycled past. Unable to miss such an opportunity, I backtracked and arrived as the Humboldt State University's marine mammal stranding team were recording morphometric data and collecting samples. And as sad as it is to see a dead whale on the beach, I also find it fascinating. You can suddenly appreciate how huge they are, these animals you usually only glimpse at sea. And chatting with the stranding team, they described the whale as borderline emaciated, but they hadn't found any obvious cause of death. At the start of last year, scientists in Baja had already noticed that many of the whales arriving at the lagoons were emaciated, and shortly after that the number of strandings increased above normal levels and the unusual mortality event was declared. And here you can see how much higher the number of strandings was last year in orange and at the start of this year in green, compared with the long-term average shown in dark blue. Still in Northern California, I had a chance to go fishing for Dungeness crab near Arcata with Gary, one half of Gary and Jan, who very kindly put me up for a few days while I was there. Dungeness crab are highly sought after both recreationally and commercially, and the commercial fishery generates a huge amount of revenue from California to Alaska. The crabs are caught in baited pots put on the seabed in coastal waters, and the pots are marked with floating buoys secured with rope. And the whales can and do become entangled in these vertical ropes. Teams of trained disentanglement volunteers are on standby all along the coast. And in this case, they successfully freed a grey whale that had become entangled in Dungeness crab fishing gear off the coast of Port Angeles, Washington, in April this year. But whales that remain entangled often sustain terrible injuries, including amputations from the weight of the gear, which slows them down, and it can impede their foraging, leading to a loss of body condition, plus the risk of infection and starvation. 8 grey whales were reported entangled in fishing gear off the coast of California, Oregon and Washington last year, and unprecedented numbers of whale entanglements between 2014 and 2016 were attributed to the effects of the blob that altered prey distribution and drew foraging whales, particularly humpback whales, much closer to shore. Measures taken to minimise the risk of whales getting entangled have included complete closures of the fishery, aerial surveys to better understand whale distribution, and also modifications of the fishing gear. Still in Arcata, by now it was a week into November, and I was already a couple of weeks behind schedule. I was still keen to reach the lagoons of Baja, but I was starting to wonder if part of that journey might need to be by bus. South of Arcata, the road travels inland through the Humboldt Redwoods State Park, and when Gary offered me a lift to Fort Bragg, where the road meets the coast again, I was torn. It kind of felt like cheating, but in the end I accepted his kind offer, saving me about 3 days of cycling through hilly bare country. But any time I'd made up by getting a lift with Gary was promptly lost when a spoke snapped as I cycled south from Fort Bragg. I'd not experienced spoke issues before, but I soon discovered that a snapped spoke instantly results in a wobbly, not quite circular wheel that upsets the brakes. My solution was to disconnect the back brake altogether, which was not a champion solution. But a couple of days later I was on my way again, now with my sights set firmly on San Francisco. Along the way I had 2 more grey whale sightings, one from near Point Arena Lighthouse and another from the coastal highway. The good news was that I reached San Francisco, somewhere that had seemed unfeasibly far away when I first set out. The bad news was that another spoke snapped along the way, resulting in more time wasted, this time getting all of my spokes replaced. More good news, though, was that because I was in San Francisco on the weekend, there were grey whale watching trips running, and this was the bad news. I did not see any grey whales. But back on the road again, it was great to bump into Sarah and Siggy, a couple of cyclists I'd met north of San Francisco. We were all heading to the same campsite that day, which turned out to have a very healthy raccoon population. And it was just great to have some company on the road and friendly faces waiting at the top of the hills. Funnily enough, I never had to wait for them. By the time I reached Moss Landing, where I saw this sea otter, another of my new spokes had already snapped, and I'd spent my time in Santa Cruz buying a whole new back wheel. But I'm pleased to report that having spent very nearly the value of the bike on repairs, nothing else broke after that. My bike finally worked. My next stop was Monterey, somewhere I'd wanted to visit for years. Not only is Monterey Bay on the migration route of many marine species, but a submarine canyon means you can get deep water species occurring close to shore, and annual upwelling cycles that bring nutrients up from the deep enhance the productivity of the water, resulting in abundant marine life. One of the first things I did, naturally, was go on a whale watching trip. Although a couple of grey whales had been seen recently in the bay, we didn't see any. But there were plenty of feeding humpback whales, plus otters, sea lions, Pacific white-sided dolphins, and a new species for me, northern right whale dolphins. If you've ever seen the Blue Planet footage of grey whales being hunted by killer whales, that was filmed in Monterey Bay. Nancy Black, the owner of the whale watching company and a killer whale expert, explained how the submarine canyon poses a real risk to grey whales, particularly the females travelling north with calves that are just a few months old. Their best defence against killer whales is usually hugging the coastline, but whether they cut straight across the bay or hug the coast, they still have to cross the deeper water over the canyon. And Nancy told me about the grey whales' snorkelling behaviour. As they head north, they surface so quietly, only exposing their blowholes, that often the first she knows of their presence is when the killer whales launch their attack. Another killer whale danger zone that the whales have to negotiate is near Unimak Island in Alaska. More than 150 transient killer whales aggregate there each spring, as the grey whales near the Bering Sea. And of 7 attacks observed during a 4-year study there, most were on calves and year-old animals. After several hours of feeding on a grey whale after a successful hunt, the killer whales usually left, but would then return over several days to continue feeding on the submerged carcass. And this photo shows visible teeth marks on the pectoral fin of a grey whale that had been attacked. Also, 43% of western grey whales feeding off Sakhalin Island were found to bear scars from killer whales. That's the highest document prevalence of killer whale scars for any species of baleen whale. Weller et al. Also noticed that the acquisition of new scars wasn't limited to calves. The adults got attacked too. You can see there's some scars there behind the eye of the whale, on the throat and on the edges of the pectoral fin. And the attacks were presumed to occur during the migration or on the wintering grounds, given that little aggression has been observed between grey whales and killer whales off Sakhalin Island. Whilst I was in Monterey, I had a chance to meet a lovely team of people who volunteer for BayNet, an initiative that's been up and running since 1995. Volunteer naturalists engage with members of the public, both to share their knowledge and to educate people about how best to avoid disturbing the wildlife they've come to see. And 2 of the BayNet volunteers I met, Robert Scholes and Ron Eby, are really testament to the power of citizen science. The findings of their observational study of the behaviour of otters near Moss Landing, which started after Robert noticed otter prints at the water's edge, has resulted in an ongoing long-term study and really transformed the approach to otter conservation locally. Since meeting them, references to their study have cropped up all over the place. Robert also volunteers at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where he introduced me to some of the team. And it's such an impressive place. I absolutely recommend visiting if you get the chance. As well as the exhibits, there are telescopes set up on an outside viewing area, and you can watch the otters snoozing in the kelp and whales further out in the bay. My next breakfast meeting was with Professor Bob Fryenhoek, an evolutionary biologist who worked as a senior scientist at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute from 1999 to 2017. It was in 2002, while he was using a remotely operated vehicle to search for a clam bed in the depths of Monterey Canyon, that he found the skeleton of a grey whale that had been colonised by what turned out to be a novel genus of bone-eating worms, Ossidax worms. And this is the skeleton that he found those worms on, photographed through time in the depths of the canyon at almost 3,000 metres of depth. 21 species of Ossidax worm have now been identified in Monterey Bay and beyond, including some in Japan that are genetically identical to their Monterey Bay relatives, suggesting incredible ocean-wide dispersal skills. And there are lots of things about these worms that fascinate me, but one of the coolest things is that although they were only discovered relatively recently, Osedax worms have actually been around for more than 66 million years. Fossilized skeletons of plesiosaurs, large marine reptiles that swam in prehistoric seas, show evidence of having been colonized by these worms. Someone else I'd been looking forward to meeting was Dr. Bob Brownell Jr., a marine mammal expert and senior scientist with NOAA. He very kindly took me to see the whalers' cabin at Point Lobos, a cabin that was built in the 1850s to house Japanese and Chinese fishermen. The Carmel Whaling Company conducted shore-based whaling from Point Lobos from 1862 to 1879, and the building is now a museum. As well as stacks of whale bones, there were harpoons, flensing tools, try-pots where blubber was boiled, and old barrels that had been used to store whale oil. A map in the museum showed this was one of 16 shore whaling stations in California that whaled between 1854 and the early 1900s. One of the reasons I was so keen to meet Dr. Bob Brownell, besides the hundreds of papers he's published on marine mammals over the years, was that he's led the US side of the joint Russian-American research on the western grey whale since 1995. As Bob showed me around, I tried to pick his brain and was happy to hear that he believes that a relic western grey whale population still exists with a wintering ground in the western Pacific. Both the genetic differentiation between western and eastern grey whales and the sighting and stranding records from Japan and China during the winter and spring months support this. Worryingly though, a recent population assessment for Snorkelling grey whales estimates that no more than 50 individuals belong to the relic western population, putting them in dire threat of extinction. To the south of Monterey is Big Sur, a rugged but beautiful stretch of coastline. Thanksgiving traffic on the narrow, twisty highway made for some close calls, but it was the weather that nearly pushed me over the edge, quite literally at times. Storm-force winds and torrential rain triggered numerous rockfalls, and the highway was promptly closed to cars. I tried to sit it out for a day, but there was no sign of the weather abating, so I pushed on, and I had the toughest day of cycling of my trip, covering just 30 miles to reach San Simeon. It was totally worth it, though, to see these elephant seals hauled out on the beach there. And I also celebrated surviving the storm by having noodles for breakfast as well as for supper. Terrestrial wildlife sightings continued as I headed south, including an unexpected herd of zebra, yet another bear, what I thought was a fox, but the people of Instagram told me was actually a coyote, and on my last night of camping, a rabbit-slaying owl. Reaching Los Angeles, I was finally able to meet Elisa Schulman-Janiger, director of the Grey Whale Census and Behaviour Project. This shore-based count of migrating grey whales has been taking place from Palos Verdes Peninsula near LA since 1984. Trained volunteers maintain a lookout for whales throughout daylight hours from the 1st of December to late May each year, so covering both the southward and the northward migrations. When I visited the census team on the 8th of December, it was exactly a year to the day since the team had seen their first southbound whale of the previous season. I was hoping for a repeat performance, but it was another 4 days before the first grey whale of the 2019 southward migration was recorded. And you can see on the graph from the census website that the numbers of whales migrating south were slightly lower in December than usual. And although 2 whales reached one of the Baja lagoons on the 10th of December, the majority of the whales were still to the north of me. Having fallen further and further behind schedule throughout the trip, I now only had 12 days until my visa waiver for the United States expired, and also a family funeral to return home for. So that's where my cycling ended, after 1,746 miles of cycling through 4 states. Adding up the estimated miles also travelled by ferry, 1 lift and 1 train journey, my grand total came to 3,900 and 99 miles, making me think I should maybe have logged just one more mile on the bike. Thankfully, the trip didn't put me off noodles, grey whales, or cycling. I'd managed to see grey whales in 6 different locations along my route, which is also the number of bike shops I had to visit for emergency repairs. And although my concerns about the weather and bears had proved to be legitimate, I hadn't succumbed to either. My survival instinct had stopped me ever getting a photo of a bear, but I love this illustration of the bear that I almost cycled into on my first night of camping in Alaska. Back home, though, my trip didn't feel quite complete, and in February of this year, I flew back to LA. This was no longer the grey whale cycle. I left my bike at home, and I travelled to Baja by bus. And not only did I encounter grey whales in the lagoons, but I encountered the friendly whales I had read about. Seeing a 40-ton whale actively work to stay within scratching distance of a boatload of tourists was and will probably remain one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. To see the whales so close was simply amazing. This was far from the end of my journey. The more I see, hear and read about grey whales, the more interesting I find them. There will definitely be further grey whale adventures, and I think searching for a relic population in the Western Pacific would be an excellent sequel. In the meantime, I'm still adding to my blog from the journey. There's lots more to come. And if you have an idea for an adventurous journey with a marine theme, the funding page of the IMarEST website is definitely worth a visit. And finally, thanks again to the family of David Henderson and the IMarEST for supporting my idea. Huge thanks also to the people who helped me along the way, sharing their knowledge, putting me up, and feeding me. I met so many more people than I've been able to mention here, so thank you. And also to those of you who offered long-range WhatsApp support throughout my trip. It really kept me going. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the question and answer session after an absolutely amazing presentation from Dr. Becci Jewell, who joins me now, and she gave us a wonderful insight into her journey down the west coast of the USA and Canada on the grey whale cycle. And if you need to ask any questions, please do it through the Slido tool. Ask any question. There's no question that's too simple or too stupid. Please ask away or send in compliments. That'd be fantastic. Let's just start off with a few warm-up questions for you, Becci. We've just been chatting, but how far did you cycle on this journey again? Remind us.
Oh, I think it was something like 1,740 something miles, but very, very slowly. So it took a long time.
So why did you cycle? That, you know, you're mad.
It seemed like a good idea when I first thought of it. And some elements I think were, you know, pretty sensible. I was hoping my speed would be kind of similar to that of the migrating whales. So I hoped I could kind of track their progress. And I just knew that I'd see more, I'd notice more about the environment. I would have more encounters with people. It just seemed like a good way to travel to really make the most of the journey. But there were definitely days where I did question that, and then it was a horrible idea.
But you weren't actually a cyclist, were you? You were not a sort of a long distance ultra cyclist.
No, I was not at all. But I mean, a long trip is just like lots of shorter trips, I guess. It was quite a steep learning curve in terms of mastering, what to take and how to get my daily routine sorted. But I survived just.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll come back to cycling a bit later. I'm passionate about cycling, but let's come back to the grey whale. So do you think this species will be around in 2050?
I do. I have more concerns for the western grey whale population, of course, now that with the recent information that's come to light in terms of their movements and the population being potentially even smaller than was initially thought, then I think they're in a pretty dire situation. But in the eastern Pacific, although I mean, we've got the unusual mortality event at the moment and a general decline in the body condition of the whales. I think they've maybe got difficult times ahead. Certainly, we're expecting to see even more of these marine heat waves that we've already seen in the last 5 or so years. So yeah, they are facing multiple stresses at the moment. There's no way around it. So I don't know the status of the population in years to come, but hopefully they will persist. Yeah.
And do you know, there's a lot of developments in the sort of the US blue economy, such as offshore renewables, aquaculture. Does those sorts of those initiatives, do they threaten or interfere with the migration paths?
I know some of the developments that have been happening off the west coast at the moment have tended to be further offshore than the kind of migratory corridor of the grey whales. They're for the bulk of the migration, they really hug the coast. I think mostly travelling within 10 kilometres of shore.
We seem to have lost her a second. We'll just give Becci a second.
Port.
Oh, here we go. Sorry, we lost you for for a minute there. Can you repeat the answer?
Sorry. I've got a warning that my internet connection is unstable. That's what living in a small fishing village brings with it.
No problem.
I think the threats in terms of things like renewables projects, a lot of that happens further offshore than where the grey whales typically travel. They're usually within about 10 kilometres of shore for the majority of the migratory corridor. So I think it would be things, shipping and coastal fisheries, anthropogenic noise. I'd say those are the threats, as well as the oceanographic changes. Those are the threats that I'd be most concerned about for the grey whales at the moment.
Yeah. Why do they stay within 10 kilometres of the shore? What's the rationale for that migratory path?
I know that when they're travelling north and there are young calves travelling with their mothers, just a few months old at that point, their main defence against the killer whales is to really hug the shore. And a common response when whales are attacked by killer whales is to try and get really into the shallows. There was the study up in Alaska with the transient killer whales hunting the grey whales there, and they said if a juvenile grey whale, if it could get to kind of 3 meters water depth or less, the killer whales would usually give up hunting, and they'd have a chance of surviving. But yeah, they also hug the coast on the southward migration too.
Yeah, you sort of made the suggestion that the western migratory whales may not even exist. It may just be the sort of same population, just taking a different path. That sounds quite serious, really, because that puts the population at half or a quarter of what we thought it was.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so little known about those animals as well that a lot of the information there comes from animals that have stranded or have been by-caught in fishing gear. So it's the future for the western population, I would say, is looking pretty bleak.
And has that been significantly impacted by countries like Japan, which obviously do hunt whales, and has that had an impact, and that's why the western population is so poor?
Well, they were historically impacted by hunting, the same as the eastern population, but I think again it will be a multitude of reasons. It's not just the hunting, but it will also be fishing practices, potential disturbance within their feeding areas. There's quite a lot of oil and gas exploration that overlaps with the feeding areas that the western grey whales use. So, and without even really knowing exactly where they're going, it's hard to imagine, what other impacts they're experiencing. So I'd say there's a lot going on to consider.
So it seems like there's quite a lot of science down the western coast of the USA that's studying that sort of eastern population. Is there similar sorts of science and conservation watchers on the other side of the Pacific?
There's a lot of research happens from Sakhalin Island in Russia. So that's during the summer months when the whales are there for the feeding So yeah, then there's been some really good research has come out of there. And that's even what Professor Bruce Mate was trying to study when they attached the satellite tags to some whales off the coast of Sakhalin Island. They were hoping to learn more about the migration over in the west, but of course all the whales that had the tags actually then came to the east. So it didn't go, it was interesting, but it's not quite what they were trying to achieve, I think.
So how do they actually attach the tags to the grey whales?
I think for the satellite tags, because they have quite the longevity, I think those are actually implanted, but I think they have a barb that goes into the blubber of the whale. But if you use the shorter term tags that are looking just more at the dive behaviour, short-term dive behaviour, they're often suction cup tags.
Okay.
There's a few different methods out there.
Yeah. And how many whales did they actually tag for the satellite migration?
On that occasion, they tagged 7. Over 2 seasons, they deployed 7 tags, but I think a lot of them didn't. They remained on while the whales were feeding within that area, but they didn't stay on long enough to get the movements that occurred at the end of the feeding season.
Okay. Do you know if there's any other good cycling journeys you could do to follow other migratory routes? And is that something you're planning to do?
Yes, I think following animals has become my new hobby, but I'm not sure where to start. I was actually, before this, I was Googling about bears in Japan, because I would like to do a trip over kind of in the region of the Western population. I'd like to go back to Russia and Japan also. But they do have a lot of bears there. But there are so many migratory routes that could be covered. I mean, Australia springs to mind also for the humpback whale migrations there up both coasts, and there's so much potential.
Yeah. Okay then. How big is the population of grey whales? Do we know how many there is? We've got an estimate range between the low number and high number.
We've got one of the last estimates of abundance for the eastern population was nearly 27,000 grey whales.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds a lot, but it's not, is it?
Yeah, the situation can change pretty quickly, as we've seen before. So it's good at the moment, but that's not to say it will stay that way.
Yeah. We've got a question come in from somebody who's asked about the damage to the kelp beds, the bull kelp beds, and whether there's been any recovery of that ecosystem that you're aware of.
Recovery, in the same paper where I was reading about how the loss of kelp had been kind of reduced in areas that were already protected, so they had greater biodiversity of the predators of the urchins. Not only did those areas that were protected, they lost less kelp initially, they also had a better recovery. But I haven't read of areas where they've had total loss. I've not read of those areas recovering. So I know there are a few schemes being explored. When I was in Port Orford, I was able to speak with Tom Galvanese, the station manager of the Port Orford field station. And they were saying one idea they're exploring is whether they could actually kind of harvest the purple urchins, collect them. And because at the moment they're in a starving state, the urchins they've wiped out the kelp, so they no longer have anything to eat, but they can persist in this kind of starved mode. So it's not like they die off and the kelp can return, they just remain and it means that the kelp will not become re-established. So they're wondering if they can remove those urchins, and then if they can feed them up in tanks on shore, whether they could then have that available for the sushi market. I know they already export a lot of seafood to Asia for sushi. So I don't know, that there are schemes like that are being explored, which is really interesting, but I don't know of anywhere where that's already been implemented and they've seen kelp return.
So what's the natural predator for a purple sea urchin?
That would be things like spiny lobster, otters, sheephead fish, and also the sea stars normally, but there's just been a massive die-off also of the sea stars with the wasting disease. So yeah, it's really been a bad time for the marine ecosystem.
It just goes to demonstrate the complexity of the ecosystem. You know, change one thing here and another thing over there. It's the butterfly wings and the storm,
Exactly.
isn't it?
And I
Yeah.
think also we forget that we've already changed it, the whole like shifting baseline kind of paradigm. You forget that the situation that you kind of had 10 years previously isn't even kind of the natural like balance for the ecosystem, because there were otters in the south of Oregon that would have been keeping urchins in check, but they were hunted for fur. They're no longer around in that area, and there's just a lot to it. It's very complex situations.
Yeah. We've had a question come in from Heather Fowl, and she says, thanks, Becci, for a fantastic and interesting talk.
Thank you.
Any ideas on how we can help with research of the western grey relic population and the migratory corridor study?
Ooh, well, I don't know what we can do to help at the moment, but something that I only read about like 2 days ago, because I had this idea while I was cycling, so I was asking people about it, because there's a study that I'd wanted to fit into my talk, but I just couldn't, where they've used satellite images to count grey whales in the lagoons of Baja in order to get estimates of abundance without the expense of surveys, etc. So I was wondering whether that same satellite technology that can see the grey whales in the lagoons of Baja could also be implemented in the Western Pacific to maybe search for if there's a wintering area in the West. So I asked a few people about that, and I didn't get very encouraging replies. I think because the area that it could be is quite vast. I mean, really vast. There's historical whaling records that give some information, but they're not that accurate always. And there's so little known, it's difficult to even narrow it down. But then I did read in the abstract book from the SMM conference in Barcelona that was in December, there was actually someone that presented about doing exactly that, using satellite technology to try and find out about the western grey whale's potential wintering area. So I haven't got in touch with them yet, but I'm definitely going to, because I'm very keen to hear more about that.
Yeah. So the IMarEST has recently formed a marine mammals special interest group. What role can our global membership, help in raising awareness and understanding of the species and the protection of it?
Well, I think just using your platform really just to share this kind of information. I think it's already, you're nice and established with a kind of global readership. It would be an excellent platform to kind of get information out there. And what I think would be really cool from the special interest group is, because of kind of the intersection between the engineering and the technology and the biology in these kind of topics, would be to really concentrate on these kind of ways that we can use technology, like the cutting edge developments, to shed light on this kind of question. So like the satellite technology and increasing use of drones for studying marine ecosystems and species. I think that kind of thing to really get information from people at the forefront of their field, that would be really cool.
Yeah. You're a great role model as a scientist, and we've had a great question come in that says, can you tell us a bit more about your professional background and what opportunities or career paths are there for recent graduates who are interested in marine mammals?
Oh, okay. Thank you. So my background is in marine mammal science, and I started out doing an undergraduate degree at the University of Plymouth, studying marine biology and coastal ecology. But since then, I've always been keen to do hands-on work, to get experience. So, I mean, it caused some problems during my undergrad degree, because I would often agree to go on these surveys and things that may have overlapped with term time and things. But by the time I finished my degree, I'd volunteered on a number of different marine mammal projects that really helped give me experience, and also helped me to know where I wanted to kind of focus for for the future and moving forward. So that was great. But I came out of my undergrad degree knowing that I didn't really have the quantitative skills that are needed for biological sciences. So quantitative skills don't come to me naturally. It's not my favorite thing, but it really is an absolute necessity. So my next step was to do a master's in environmental biology, which I came up to St Andrews in Scotland to do. So that was a tough year. There weren't very many laughs, but that's been really, really helpful. And then
you're very good at counting bears, so you've got some quantitative skills.
Yeah, there were fewer bears than I've got digits, so I kept track of that. But anything greater than that, it gets more complicated. But yeah.
So how do young people get into marine mammals? I mean, it's a really good question, and it's probably a science that probably needs as many scientists as it can get.
I guess just reaching out to people, trying to get in touch with people. I started going to conferences quite early on and really enjoyed meeting people there and actually speaking with people rather than just reading their work. And it was surprising, but after a few conferences, you start recognizing people, and a lot of opportunities came just networking, but in a relaxed and fun way, not a scary networking way.
Yeah. So how old do grey whales actually get? What's the typical lifespan of a grey whale?
So from what I've read, the average lifespan is like 50 to 60 years, but I know there was one whale that I think they worked out the age was like late 70s, closer to 80, but it's a bit harder to establish with baleen whales. You can't do the counting of layers in teeth, but up towards maximum of, I think it was 77 I've read. That's
incredible for an animal that is just so massive. I mean, how much do they weigh again?
Typically? Up to 40 tons,
40 tons. Wow. Yeah. Wow. And how much do they have to eat every day to sustain 40 tons?
That I don't know, but I mean, and given him also, if you think about it, they're not, because of their migration, they're not even eating every day. They're only really on the feeding grounds for like 5-6 months of the year. So their food consumption in that time must be pretty epic to then sustain the journeys that they do before they're back on the feeding grounds. It's quite remarkable.
And you mentioned about the Mackay tribe and sort of they'd been into whaling, then they'd stopped. How do you feel about them going back into hunting of whales?
Yeah, that's it's. I mean, I guess mostly I feel it is part of their cultural heritage. It is something that they've done dating back thousands of years. So I don't really feel it's my place to oppose it or otherwise. But then I did also really enjoy when I met members of the Quileute tribe who now have a welcoming of the whales ceremony. Okay. So just that. Yeah, it was nice to hear about that, but also I think there's something to be said for the cultural history of these practices.
So how do you welcome a whale?
I think you sing and dance and offer some salmon as well. But I'd love to be there for the ceremony one year. Can
you give us a demonstration of the singing and dancing?
You don't want that. You really don't.
And so how many bears did you actually see?
So bears in total, I think, I had multiple sightings on Kodiak Island. The initial, the scariest of them all was the almost cycling into the bear, but then also there were more glimpses as I was cycling. And at one point I was crossing a bridge on my way back to Kodiak and I saw some fishermen down on the riverbank and I just gave them a friendly wave and they shouted back like, "There's a bear just over there." And they kind of pointed, but I wasn't hanging around to see where they were pointing exactly. I just kind of went for it and I was out of there as quickly as I could. But the bear sightings, I kept expecting to kind of cycle out of their range, but it turns out they really do live pretty much all along the west coast. So I was seeing them even in the last 2 weeks of the trip. And And I stopped asking people as well, because usually when I'd ask people like, oh, do you get bears here? They'd be like, oh yes, of course, and then they'd start telling me about mountain lions or something as well. So it was better just to not mention it in the end and pretend everything was fine.
Super. Okay, just a few voter thanks that have come in from a few people. So Rob at the UK Hydrographics office has said, not a question, just wanted to say what an excellent trip, fascinating talk, really enjoyed it. Good luck with your next adventure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
What is your next adventure then? Is it going to be in Japan or?
It might be Japan, or really Kamchatka in Russia would be amazing too, but we'll have to see.
They're big bears there, aren't they?
Yeah, really big bears.
Yeah, they're the real big killer ones, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
And another sort of accolade. So Becky Walker has said, a fantastic presentation, really interesting insights into this amazing marine mammal. Glad you got to your final destination in Bahia.
Excellent, thank you. I was glad to get there too.
Yeah. Another question that's just come in is, you mentioned about the impacts of fishing gear on whale entanglement. Can technology or new fishing gear help minimise the risk to whales? Yes,
yeah, it can, and that's something that's being kind of worked on in a number of places, like globally. The development really of kind of ropeless fishing gear is what people are aiming for, but it's difficult to make it. There's a lot of challenges in implementing that on the scale of the fisheries. So another development that would be easier to implement would be like a timed release mechanism on the vertical rope marking the pots, so that the vertical rope, which is really the threat, that would be present for less time and minimize the risk or reduce the risk that way. But there are plenty of developments being worked on, and there's a lot of will to find solutions. I was impressed with how much is being done to deal with this on the West Coast.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Nuru Doran has said, great presentation, Becky, well done on the adventure. I know you had some challenges. And I think Mr. Colin Grant, somebody you might know, says, hi, Becky. So glad that the trip was exciting and interesting as you presented to us when we decided to award the 2019 grant to you. So well done.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the grant. I'm absolutely sure that without the grant and the timelines that came with it, I would still be thinking about this and planning it and Googling how fast bears can run. So it was absolutely the David Henderson Inspiring Journey grant that made this happen. So thank you very much.
So, well, thank you very much. On behalf of the Institute, we'd like to thank you for being our Sir Stanley Gray presenter today. Absolutely great presentation. I really enjoyed it. There's been a great set of questions that have come in from the people that watched the presentation, and I've really enjoyed our dialogue today. So thank you very much, Dr. Becci Jewell. We hope to hear from your adventures in a few years' time. So good luck with the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting me. And thank you for people for watching this too. It's been a great experience. Thank you.
It'll be on IMarEST TV forever now, so we'll always be able to refer back to it. So fame forever. Thank you, Becky. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody for your attention, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.